this time. Okay, hello everybody. Cousin Jacks and Cockneys, that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. As Ben, you might have already heard Ben say, the focus on Cornish emigration research is usually on the Cornish who went abroad to Australia, America, and just about anywhere around the world. You know, the cousin Jacks and Jennies that we're very familiar with. But there are many other aspects of Cornish migration which have been overlooked, including internal migration within the UK. Now, back in 2016, the Institute of Cornish Studies held a Cornish Connections Symposium in London. And that was an opportunity to look at migration between Cornwall and London in both directions. And for that, I did some basic research, and I'd love to be able to report now that I've done some more recent research since 2016, but I'm afraid it's still very much on my very long to-do list, so I haven't got any great updates from that date. So tonight's talk is going to be rather impressionistic rather than a definitive coverage of the subject, but it does raise some interesting questions. Now, one of the first things I did was I used the official census statistics from 1851 to 1911, and to look at people in London who were born in Cornwall and people in Cornwall who were born in London. When I say London, I'm talking about London, the City of London, plus what they called the metropolitan parts of Middlesex, Surrey and Kent, the surrounding counties of London. Of course, London today is now spread out much further, but even in the 19th century, it wasn't just the City of London. So London, of course, was very varied, probably more so than Cornwall. You might, I know it's not a great picture, but this is from Charles Booth's poverty maps of London. And if I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's the central area, the grey area there is the City of London. And then over to the west is the West End. And the colours there, you can see that they're oranges and yellows. That's because that marks the affluent areas, the richer areas. The poorer areas, which are the East End, are where the colours which are, oops, just go back there, colours which are the blacks and the blues. So that's the poorer area of London. So London is very varied in the 19th century. Now, I have to declare an interest here because I am definitely far more Cockney than Cornish. My ancestors came from East London. And if you can actually read the key to Charles Booth's maps, you'll see that the black areas, the streets marked in black, are the lowest classes of vicious and semi-criminals. And the blue are very poor, casual, all in chronic want. Well, actually, my grandfather or great-grandfather was born just above the London docks there in that nice, very dark blue black street there. And grandma was over in the dark blue area on the top right of the screen. So I am definitely of Cockney origins rather than Cornish. So in my analysis, I looked at the Cornish-born people in London and plotted it on a graph. So you'll see that in 1851, there were just about 9,500 people in London who were born in Cornwall. And numbers increased to a peak in 1881, which is about sort of 16,500. And then it slowly declines. I did a breakdown to see, are we talking about men and women? What sort of breakdown have we got? And it turned out that there's a fairly similar pattern for male and female. More women than men, and I would suspect that's probably domestic servants in London. But it's the same sort of pattern with this peak in the 1880s. I also did a breakdown in terms of age, and this is really interesting because there are very few Cornish-born people in London who are under 20. So we're not seeing families going to London with young children. They're going unmarried or as married couples, perhaps, and having their children in London. But you're not seeing family groups with young children going to London in these years. And maybe it's the draw of the capital for the young people rather than families. So what about the other direction? What about Londoners or people from the London area in Cornwall? This shows a completely different pattern. That there's far fewer people born in London who are living in Cornwall in the census in the 19th century. But it's a steady increase. From about 1400 or so in 1851, we go up to about just over 5,000 in 1911. So there's a clear trend of more and more people from London finding their way to Cornwall. If we look at the breakdown in terms of men and women, we see a similar pattern. But actually, strangely, there's more men in some cases rather than women. So it's a somewhat different pattern for the people who are from London coming to Cornwall than Cornwall going to London. And when you look at the age of the people from London who've moved to Cornwall, there's far less difference. There's a lot more younger people, children. So you're getting families coming to Cornwall rather than just couples without children. There's a lot more children being born in London who then come to Cornwall as children. Of course, during the period that these graphs cover, the populations are changing in both London and Cornwall. London's population is going up, Cornwall's population is going down. So it's quite interesting to look at these numbers in terms of the percentage. Oops, sorry. Do it as a percentage of the population. And that's, again, very interesting. What we're seeing is that Londoners, as a percentage of the Cornish population, are increasing quite significantly, whereas Cornish-born, as a percentage of the London population, are going down, or peaking rather in 1881. So we're definitely seeing more influence from London coming down into Cornwall. The Cornish are much more dilute in London, but the Londoners are going to have a greater impact on the Cornish population. So what are all these Londoners doing in Cornwall? What jobs are they doing? Well, I do apologise, this is a bit oversensitive tonight. I analyse the various occupations because I've got all the Cornwall censuses in a access database. I can do a really good analysis of all the occupations of everybody who was born in London. And we see a lot of them are skilled tradespeople and craftspeople. There's quite a lot of military, maritime and customs officials, including sort of retired military men as well. There's a lot of people who are sort of what you call clerks and managers, managerial classes, who are London-born living in Cornwall. Professional people like lawyers, and a lot of people involved in education, particularly school teachers and governesses. There's 18 governesses and 1 tutor in 1861. There are people like professors of music. There's 3 of them that I found in the census. And then we also get various touring entertainers and salesmen. And in 1891, it's particularly noticeable that we're beginning to see the painters, the artists moving down into Cornwall. Things like the St Ives School, Newlyn School and things like that. There's a few dodgy characters who appear in the records as well. In 1840, somebody called Cockney Anne was remanded for theft in Helston. And in 1849, there was an escaped felon who was known as George Smith, aka George Yarmouth, aka Cockney George. So he obviously, again, was certainly not Cornish, probably came from London. What was particularly noticeable in the occupations of all these Londoners in Cornwall was the number of religious leaders, vicars and ministers of all faiths, including a rabbi, all born in London. And if you look at the overall picture of what the occupations of these Londoners in Cornwall, it's very obvious that they are people of local influence and power. They're not people who are labourers or the very lower classes. It's actually professional people, people who are going to have a certain amount of local influence, wealth and power in their communities in Cornwall. Now, if you look at the picture of the vicar, you'll notice he's actually smoking a cigar. And this actually was seen as being a rather a London thing. In 1828, the Royal Cornwall Gazette complained about the Cockney fashion of cigar smoking appearing in Truro. And in 1837, it said the most ordinary Cockneyism was to sit with the public coach driver and smoke. And Cockneyism is really being just used as a euphemism for all Londoners, regardless of whether they're actually true Cockneys from the East End. These dreadful Cockneys have introduced smoking into Cornwall. Now, the Cockneys, these Londoners, were also seen as rather gullible by the Cornish. You get comments like, would even the accrediting Cockney give credit to such a thing? You know, they're very gullible, these Londoners coming into Cornwall. In 1805, the Royal Cornwall Gazette referred to a Cockney narrowness of perception. The Cockneys in Cornwall were seen as ignorant of agriculture. In 1816, it said, every Cockney who had a patch of grass before his house turned merino breeder. And in 1846, the Londoners' comments on potato blight were accused of displaying an effervescence of Cockney ignorance. Not only were they ignorant about potatoes, they were ignorant about the sea. In 1821, a London barrister at court in Cornwall Assizes joked that he was ignorant of nautical matters, which must naturally be expected in a Cockney. In 1846, the Royal Cornwall Gazette criticised the editor of the Times as evidently a Cockney sailor. So you can really derisive term being used about these Londoners and almost the London view and amount of knowledge about the things which Cornish people would understand better. 1850, there's comments about a Cockney landsman or Cockney cricket critics. And of course, the Cockneys knew nothing about mining. There was a complaint in the Royal Cornwall Gazette in 1822 about London mine managers thinking that they know it all, and clearly they didn't. So Cockneyism was seen as a derisory term, and very much a case that these Cockneys thought they knew everything, but they didn't. The Cornish newspapers were full of anecdotes where a local often brings down a Cockney a peg or two. In this example, this is the story of Stee Harris and the Cockney Buck by I.T. Tregellas, written in 1879. And it's all about this commercial traveller who's expecting more reverence than the Redruthites were disposed to show. And this Cockney chap is feminised in comparison with the local miners. He femininely shouts and is selling stay laces. So it's very negative feeling. You know, he's not a real man because he's a Cockney, he's from London, he's not a true Cornishman. And these negative associations go right into the 20th century. In 1928, Morton Nance complained that young Cornish people are trying to lose their Cornish by using ugly Cockney English. So what about the Cornish people who are living in London? Unfortunately, it's much more difficult to analyse the occupations of the Cornish living in London because we don't have it all in a neat database in the same way that we do for Cornwall. But I have to say thank you very much to Ben, who introduced today's talk, because he's looked at Cockneys living in Shoreditch in 1851. And he's done a rough analysis using ancestry to find out what sort of occupations they did. And carpenters seem to feature very strongly. There were just over about 500 people who claimed a Cornish birthplace out of a total population of about 110,000. And of these, 110 were men aged between 20 and 40. And of those, about 34% of them were carpenters. But following on from that, there were also boot and shoemakers, and tailors, and furniture and cabinet makers. And the rest of the Shoreditch Cornish covered individuals with a whole raft of different jobs, which included working for the Inland Revenue, policemen, shipping clerks, coopers and wheelwrights, innkeepers, chemists, blacksmiths, a saddler, shipbuilder, and millwrights. There was even a city missionary and a piano maker from Lincolnhorn. There were remarkably few porters or shop assistants among the men. And this seems to be rather similar to what we're seeing in Cornwall. It's not the labouring poor who are moving between the two. It's people with professions and trades who are to be found having migrated either to Cornwall or to London. Ben didn't check about the women's occupation, but it seems that there weren't many recorded. But thank you for Ben for giving me that information. So there's some overlap with the occupations of Londoners in Cornwall and Cornish in London. But I get the impression that there's not so many professionals have gone from Cornwall to London. So perhaps the Cornish in London are less likely to have power and influence at a local level. But of course, Shoreditch is in the poorer side of London, so it may well be it wasn't very representative. And in the more affluent areas, it may well be that there were professional Cornish in London. And in fact, it seems quite likely, really, because there were quite a few Cornish Lord Mayors of London in this period as well. It was suggested in 1866 that perhaps the unemployed Cornish miners might find work on many of the railway building projects in and around London. And that would be some interesting research to see if anybody actually went up and to work on the railways. Now, I haven't come across any references to the Cornish in London being called cousin Jacks. That's a term that's usually associated with miners abroad. And of course, there's no mining in London. And I get the impression that perhaps the Cornish in London were more absorbed into the general population, London being much more cosmopolitan and used to diversity. The most evidence we see of Cornishmen in London is when they seek each other out. Now, in 1886, Mr. Walter Molesworth St. Aubyn was standing for Parliament, and some of the men from Helston who were living in London planned a celebration in anticipation of his victory. Now, the trouble is he didn't actually win the election, but being sensible chaps, they thought, why waste a good party? So they just went ahead and it became the first dinner for Cornishmen in London. In 1890, a new Masonic lodge was founded, especially for the convenience of Cornishmen resident in London. And it was the first one in London to be associated with a particular county. The one for Devon wasn't put together until 10 years later. And by that time, the dinner for Cornishmen in London had become an annual event. But it was definitely for Cornish men. The ladies weren't invited until 1898, which is when the Cornish Club was formed. And the Cornish Club eventually became the London Cornish Association. And around this time, Cornish associations were springing up everywhere, anywhere from Birmingham to Adelaide in Australia. This is part of a hugely popular trend for regional or county associations and events in London. Devon and East Anglia residents were also holding their own dinners in London as well. And these dinners were huge. They were attended by hundreds of people. In 1898, over 200 people attended a concert for Cornishmen, Cornishwomen, and their friends. Over 400 attended the 1898 annual dinner for Cornishmen, and that went up to 500 in 1902. In 1907, again, there was over 500 people at the London Cornish Association annual dinner. And the Lord Mayor, Sir William Purdy Trelaw, a good Cornishman, said at the time that he did not think any other county could show such a large and distinguished a body of county people as were present at that night. And generally, the Cornish in London were being described as more clannish than the Scots. So these great dinners that they were holding were wonderful networking opportunities, attended by leading politicians and business people. So it was a really good chance for Cornish people up in London to get to know useful contacts. But there were also cultural events with musical entertainment. In 1908, those attending the annual garden party organised by the Society of Cornishmen in London included people like the Mayor of Hackney and members of the Borough Council, and they were all asked to join in the ancient ferry dance, which I would love to have seen photographs of that. How recognisable these activities in London would have been to the Cornish in Cornwall might be debatable. In 1909, there were printed invitations to the 8th annual West Country Festival in London, which were partly written in a generic West Country dialect, which would probably make us cringe today. Now, it does seem that a lot of these events were all rather middle class or elite gatherings, and it does make me wonder how representative they were of the majority of Cornish in London. So how does this fit with the metropolitan view of Cornwall as being a sort of uncivilized place in the 19th century? There's often referred to as Cornwall being West Barbary, as being completely uncivilized. And also that the Cornish were very superstitious. In 1904, the London papers suggested that the Cornish at the Lizard might think that Marconi's aerials were responsible for causing the very bad weather there at the time. There was very little differentiation between Cornish and English identity amongst the Cornish in London. In 1998, chairing the annual dinner, Michael Williams, High Sheriff of Cornwall, said that Cornishmen in all parts of the world were not only proud of the fact that they were Englishmen, but also that they were Cornishmen. And the toast, "The County," was followed by the Cornish national anthem, Trelawney, which was sung by over 400 people present. I think you'd be on rather dodgy ground today if you suggested having a toast to county in Cornwall today. There are also quite a few people at the time who were sort of adopted a dual Cornish Cockney identity. In 1907, a correspondent to the Royal Cornwall Gazette signed himself off as a Cornu Cockney. And much later, in 1947, a gentleman called Sir Harold Bellman entitled his book of reminiscences and reflections as Cornish Cockney. Interestingly, he freely admitted that he is neither Cornish nor Cockney by birth, although Cornish by ancestry, and was born in Paddington. But he claimed that both were significant influences in his successful business career. So maybe that's a reminder that we shouldn't place too much importance on where you were born. And when we come to analyse the figures as well, we don't really know, for example, how many Londoners moving to Cornwall were the children of earlier generations of Cornish who'd moved to London, for example, or vice versa. Or how many were migrating to the homes of native marriage partners. And perhaps we should think about what is more important to your identity, whether you were where you were born or where you grew up or spent the important parts of your life. I know I've only sort of very quickly touched on this topic. Clearly there's a scope for an awful lot of work to be done in this area, and it would be fascinating to do some more on this subject. So that's just a rather brief overview, really, of what we found on this. But maybe people have got some stories tonight that they can share. Thank you.